In this video, we'll look at the settlements of the Puritans in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was a little bit after Jamestown. To begin with, though, you need to realize, again, what the Puritans believed in. And they believed in predestination and that their God already knows everything, and so God knows who's saved. Now, they didn't know who was saved, so they lived very strict lives, hoping that they were one of the saved. And, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, all those other churches believed that everybody could be saved. And, they just had to follow the given protocol or the given sacraments in terms of the Catholic faith. Well, there were two groups of Puritans in England during James I's reign. The first were people who thought, well, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, it's irredeemable. It's always going to think everybody can be saved, so they're separatist, and they just want to leave the Church of England. They just want to break completely. And then there were those Puritans who still considered themselves in the Church of England, but they believed that if they demonstrated their piety, if they demonstrated their faith, they could convince the church to reform. They'd adopt predestination. And so technically they still remained in the church. And these two groups of people are going to form separate colonies. In the early 1600s, the separatists fled to Leyden, Holland, where they were allowed to practice their faith. But once in Holland, however, they found that their children were becoming Dutch. And, Holland was very tolerant and religiously, and the Puritans led a communal, strict life. It just didn't fit, and their kids were starting to speak Dutch and all that. And so they got permission from the Virginia Company to settle in Virginia, where they thought they could practice their faith without having their kids become like foreign. These Puritan separatists leaving Leyden, Holland became known as the Pilgrims, and they ventured across the Atlantic on the ship Mayflower in the year 1620, so just over 10 years after Jamestown had been founded. The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock on Cape Cod. This was more north of the Virginia Company's charter, and many historians believe that they intentionally settled more northward to be more independent, to be separate from the Virginia Company's oversight. Once they landed, they signed the famous Mayflower Compact, which, like the House of Burgesses 2 years before in Virginia, showed the roots of American democracy. The Mayflower Compact allowed all the 35 Pilgrims, or those they deemed them elect, one of the predestined, and thus official church member, to have equal voting rights. I should note that it didn't grant such rights to the other 67 people aboard the Mayflower because they had not had the Pilgrims' conversion experience and were not deemed to be one of the elect. After landing on Plymouth Rock and giving thanks for their safe arrival, they established the Plymouth colony inside Cape Cod, which was a better location for a permanent residence protected from the Atlantic. The leader of the Pilgrims was William Bradford, who served as governor in Plymouth colony until 1657, so he was there almost 3 decades. He was an able leader and was also famous because he wrote a history of the colony, so we know a lot about what happened. There was some tension with the local Indians, especially when disease really hit, but not as much as in Virginia. 2 Indians who had been brought back to England on an earlier English exploratory mission, and they had learned English, but they were known as Samoset and Squanto. Samoset and Squanto had returned to America, and thus when the Puritans arrived, they could act as translators and soothe relations with local Indians. We know a lot about them because of Bradford's, history, but Squanto apparently just walked out of the wilderness and surprised the Pilgrims because he spoke their language and said he wanted beer. The so-called First Thanksgiving was to celebrate the successful harvest of the fall of 1621. Since some Indians had helped them, introducing them to the use of corn and providing other assistance, the Pilgrims invited the Indians to join the feast. The idea of having a celebration of the fall harvest, you got a good crop and you can survive the winter, wasn't, of course, unique to the Pilgrims. You think of Oktoberfest and so forth in Germany. But this is something. The first Thanksgiving is a bit of American lore there. The Plymouth colony of Pilgrims prospered not only because of the less hostile natives, but also because the Pilgrims brought their families with them, their wives and their children, and also they had that Puritan sense of community, taking care of each other. They were not simply focused on extracting wealth like gold, and remember the early Virginia settlers, and they really wanted to devote the time and energy to build a true community, and that helped them prosper. Anyway, James the First died in 1625, about 5 years after the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth. And he was followed by Charles the First, who disliked all Puritans and saw their migration to America as a win-win situation. Fewer Puritans at home and larger colonies in America for his mercantilistic trade. Charles, therefore, granted a company charter to a large group of other non-separatist Puritans, the Puritans who were trying to reform the Church of England. This much larger group of Puritans agreed, hoping to construct a perfectly godly society in the New World, as they called it. They were going to create a city on a hill. That's a phrase taken from the Bible. But their city on the hill, their colony, would be so godly that would be what would convince the Church of England to finally reform. So these non-separatist Puritans wanted to go to colonize because they're going to use their colony to impress upon the Church of England to reform. Beginning in 1630, these Puritans migrated to an area north of the Plymouth colony and settled what became known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Like Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay Colony was fortunate because they had another good governor, John Winthrop. Throughout the 1630s, as Charles I ratcheted up his prosecution of the Puritans in England, thousands of Puritans fled to Massachusetts Bay Colony. As early as the 1640s, Massachusetts Bay Colony had almost 16,000 colonists in several towns, including Roxbury, Watertown, Newton, which is now Cambridge, Charlestown, and their capital of Boston. Of course, all these towns here are part of metropolitan Boston today. This great flow in the 1630s of Puritans leaving England under the reign of Charles I became known as the Great Migration of Puritans. By the 1640s, tensions in England between Charles I and the remaining Puritans in England had grown so bad there was actually a civil war, which the Puritans won, and they executed Charles I. They cut off his head. Once the Puritans had won the English Civil War in the 1640s, they established rule in England known as the Commonwealth. There was no king. And their control, the Commonwealth, lasted for just over a decade, from 1649 to 1660. And, as it was Puritans who were ruling, it was a very strict time to be in England. No dancing, no music, and no fun. Everybody hoping that they were one of the elect. Not surprisingly, given the strict control of the Puritans, by 1660 the public was turning against the Commonwealth, and it ended when they agreed to restore the monarchy. This is known as the Restoration, and they restored it with a king known as Charles II. By this point, the Massachusetts Bay Colony continued to expand. Eventually, the Massachusetts Bay Colony just grew over the Plymouth Colony, and any distinction between the two Puritan groups evaporated. This concludes the video on the founding of the Puritan colonies of Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay.